Yes.
I've got a question about the big picture of Leviticus. When I was last taking a look at Leviticus, a book I was reading was saying that Exodus ends with the sanctuary, with the glory of God there, and that no one can enter into the sanctuary, and that Leviticus starts with the story with Aaron's two sons with their false fire when they get wiped out. And so the big picture question about Leviticus is, how do we live in the presence of God? How do we do it? Is that your understanding, or is that a big picture understanding of Leviticus to answer that question? How do we get to the presence of God?
Well, actually, so Aaron's sons offered that fire in Leviticus chapter 10.
Yes.
And then of course Leviticus 16 actually happens directly after Leviticus 10. The reason why there's a gap is because of the structure. There's a chiastic structure of Leviticus, and Leviticus 16 is actually the apex of the structure. And then if you look at the first three parts of Leviticus, you can see the pattern. So the big picture of Leviticus really isn't based on the idea of Aaron's two sons. That's part of what happens, but that's not the big picture. The big picture, the correct, you have the correct question, how do we encounter God's presence? And of course, the book of Leviticus is about the sacrifices that the Levites, the priests, would use in the ministration of the sanctuary, which was necessary for the people to behold his glory as much as they could behold at the time. And of course, involved in the liturgy and the sacraments, the sacrifices of Leviticus, is the types and shadows of Christ. Of course, everything is talking about Jesus, and then the process of encountering God. But so yeah, the book of Leviticus is dealing with the Levites in the type that's given about how to encounter God, which is going to be then explained later or revealed later in its fullness when Christ, the true sacrifice, comes. But there's a lot of the details that we read over in Leviticus that we are kind of lost in the details, and we don't really understand what it all means. That later, when you begin to look at the ministry of Christ or the instructions that Christ gives, that you begin to realize that all those details matter, and that they're not to be run over. Most people don't read the book of Leviticus because, first of all, they don't understand what they're reading, and then they get lost in all the details of the different sacrifices, and they don't realize that these are actually showing different characteristics of Christ and different needs that we have in terms of a peace offering or a guilt offering or a sin offering, those type of things. So yeah. It's interesting to me that, and I put this in my book, that you're reading, the Leviticus 16 is the apex of the chiastic structure of Leviticus.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that it's not only the apex of the structure of Leviticus, because Leviticus is in the midst of the book of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses. Leviticus is the apex of those 5 books. So there's a bigger chiastic structure of Genesis, Exodus, and Leviticus, of course, then Numbers and Deuteronomy. So actually, Leviticus 16 is actually the apex of the chiastic structure of the whole first 5 books of Moses. The whole first 5 books of Moses is about the Day of Atonement and God restoring oneness with his people through his mediation. So that's what the whole first 5 books are about. Of course, what I'm trying to share is, if that's what the first 5 books of the Bible are all about, then certainly with the Alpha and Omega principle, then that's what the book of Revelation is about too.
The prophets are subject to the prophets.
Right. So yeah, what you're going to see is the fractal idea, or the structure within the structure is what you begin to see when you begin to see it, and then that's what's so amazing.
One of the things you were mentioning was reminding me that Jesus's intercession for us, it didn't start in 1844.
Right.
But what is the emphasis then for 1844? Is it like a larger emphasis in revelation about this, which has always been happening? I mean, I know even Paul talks about Jesus interceding. So obviously Jesus didn't start, in 1844, but there's a big emphasis on the high priestly ministry in 1844, and of course the judgment of the dead. But but the dead can be judged earlier as well. So I was trying to put those things together, especially as I was looking at chapter 3 of your new book, and trying to understand, perhaps maybe it is this fractal idea. God always acts the same way, but everything is a greater revelation of the cross at different points in time, or what? How do we understand the emphasis on his priestly work in 1844 when he was already a priest as soon as he went to heaven?
Well, I think, first of all, the Day of Atonement is different than the other 7 feasts, in that the Day of Atonement actually comprises the whole gospel picture, right? So, and without having gone into the Day of Atonement with you, the details, but some of you have heard it. I mean, so, the high priest goes into the most holy place 3 times. That actually describes the 3 times that that Christ enters into the presence of the Father to mediate for us. And so this happens immediately as soon as there's sin, then there is the mediation. The Day of Atonement begins then. Because if Christ doesn't mediate, then poof, sin is destructive. And it should have been immediate. It should have been instant. So as soon as there's sin, there's a savior. Otherwise, there would be no discussion about it. I mean, so of course, we're going to learn more about that when we actually talk about Lucifer's fall and what happened there too, because the same principle applies to angels as it applies to us. But we see it. So the Day of Atonement actually begins with the Council of Peace at the foundation of the world. And this is one of the things that I begin to share when I talk about it in the book. And then, so the idea of the process being stretched out over time and space is part of the idea that God stretches out, allows the death process to stretch out over time and space, because otherwise we wouldn't understand it, and without understanding, we wouldn't be able to make an intelligent choice. So he not only stretches the death process out over time and space, which he does that by taking the sin upon himself, which he has always done since the beginning. And the cross is a revelation of that which he has been bearing in himself ever since sin existed. So that's why the cross is so phenomenal in terms of its revelation. It revealed some of the mystery that's been hidden since sin came into existence. Christ has been bearing that in himself. So this process of Christ being priest, Jesus has these different roles. We talk about prophet, then priest, then king, and he's always been all of those. But when he takes on flesh, then he not only he doesn't do it as God, or he doesn't do it as the angel of the Lord, as we see in the Old Testament. Now he's doing it as man, and as a man he walks the path of a man, but then he still bears these different roles. So a lot of this is the revelation of the eternal that James was talking about, that he's bringing down to the level of the creature that he's trying to save, so that they can understand and then make that choice that is necessary for them to make once they get that understanding. But God himself has never changed, and he never will change. And so the point is, he's always bringing himself to the level of the creature that the mind that he's trying to reach. And therein lies, profound truth about God. So this idea of Christ being high priest, well, he was always high priest. Or you say Christ being king, well, he's always king. Well, Christ always, being the prophet, the word of God, well, he's always been that. Yes, but see, the revelation, when he becomes an angel, that's a revelation to the angels. And when he becomes a man, it's a revelation to man. And so, and the true excitement that we're going to have, we see it in part with the second coronation, but Jesus has been lowering himself all this time to reach fallen creatures in their state of their fallenness. But the beauty and the day that we're going to rejoice at the 1,000 year, after the 1,000 years are over, is the restoration of Christ back to the throne as God. And he will be Jesus the angel, Michael. He will be Jesus the man, but he will be Jesus God again. And that restoration will be a glorious restoration that we will all rejoice in, because we will then much more clearly understand how far he came down and what he has done to save us. Of course, we won't understand it then either. I mean, we'll be studying through eternity, but we'll have a greater grasp of it at that point. And that's, of course, that's what the wedding feast and the Jubilee and all the joy, rejoicing that's going to take place at the end of the 1,000 years when Christ is finally exalted at his final coronation as king. That will be, that will be the great Yahoo. But so, yeah, some of these things we wrestle with now, but we tend to have this very limited idea about things, which then the danger is that the truth I don't see. I mean, I see something that's truth and I hold on to it, but if I get dogmatic about that just being truth, then I can reject so much more truth. And that's, of course, what we don't want to be doing. We want to acknowledge that which God is showing us in type or in shadow or in part. And then at the same time, we want to be open that there's greater revelations of the same principle as it applies at different time, different space, or different levels. And that's, I think, one of the secrets of learning to understand the Day of Atonement.
To that
I
point,
guess. Go ahead, Jim.
to that point, this is what Ezekiel's trying to reveal in the 8 chapters about the temple and how this temple is very different and how it was never built. That is he revealing what you're saying about Christ and his full revelation of him being God? Is that what Ezekiel's trying to get across in those 8 chapters in describing this temple, which is now much more in detail and much more fuller in how it's presented?
Yes. So you see, so if you compare the Mosaic temple to the Solomonic temple, you begin to see the Mosaic temple is simple. It's a wilderness pattern, right? And it's portable, it's carried around. But when you see Solomon build the temple, then you see that he elaborates on the symbols and it becomes much more complex, much more in depth. The same principles are there, but the details just expand. Well, the temple in Ezekiel, of course, is even an expansion of Solomon's temple. And then, so of course, that's again the same idea, that it's a fractal, but as it goes out, it expands, becomes bigger, becomes more complex, but the principle stays the same. Therefore, that's the idea.
Yeah.
So Jeff, what you were gonna?
Well, to go back to her question, you had a beautiful answer, but I don't know if you answered her question that I heard. I mean, we think of 1844 as a time period of, the judgment, but I guess is what I was thinking is, we know the earthly temple and all of Leviticus, that's pointing to the heavenly sanctuary and the role that Christ plays. We do this on a repeated yearly cycle, right, in the Old Testament. But what it's pointing to is the heavenly sanctuary that's only done once over 7,000 years. All those processes are taking place. And so that's where 1844 comes into, because it's the Day of Atonement of the earthly sanctuary that's repeated daily, but it doesn't have to be yearly, but it doesn't have to be repeated yearly with Christ. So there are events that take place during the cleansing on the Day of Atonement and the week after, and that's where we are in earth history. Is that?
Yeah. Well, yes. And so 1844, there are specific three specific times that Christ enters into the most holy place to complete the Day of Atonement. And of course, actually 1844 is the third time that he enters. No,
Right, just like the high priest had to go in 3 times.
right, that's right.
Yeah.
So yes, the problem has been in most of our understandings of Adventists is that we tend to think that 1844 was the beginning of the Day of Atonement and that he's in the most holy place and that him going in and him in the most holy place is the whole Day of Atonement. And that limited understanding has been the problem that limited our view of his work and our view of the prophecies of his work. And that's something that needs to be expanded, because the Day of Atonement, the third going in, actually the apex of the Day of Atonement isn't his third going in, it's the third time he comes out. That's actually the apex of the Day of Atonement. There's a three-step process connected to him coming out, which is the apex of Leviticus 16. And the idea here is that the atonement does not take place just in the most holy place. It begins in the day of the cleansing of the sanctuary, the judgment of the living begins in the most holy place, but then it goes out to the other three apartments. So it begins in the most holy place and it begins at the end, and then it comes out. And by the time he gets to the altar of burnt offerings at right before the outer gate, that's the last part of the Day of Atonement, and then probation closes, and of course then he comes. And so,
And I would say that's why 1844 is important, is because that process has to continue onward through Revelation chapter 20.
yes, and why Mrs.
Yeah.
White keeps telling us that we need to study the 2200 days in 1844 is because she knew that our understanding of the Day of Atonement was not correct, that it wasn't big enough, and we need to keep visiting what we thought we knew, so we would realize that again, that what we think we know is true, that is blinding us to what we're not seeing. And if we
They
would
didn't
actually
even know they didn't even know there was a sanctuary in 1844. So how
Right.
can they come out of something that they didn't even know existed in the first place?
Right. That's right. That's right. And so the point, so to your point, is that they didn't even know there's a sanctuary. Then they learn there's a sanctuary, and then they think Jesus going into the most holy place in 1844 is the totality of the Day of Atonement. And then of course, as we already know, there was different misunderstandings about the close of probation and many other things that happened in 1844 that God then has to try to, correct our thinking and open our minds to greater truths. And sometimes we get stubborn thinking that which I know is truth, and there can't be anything else. And that's been the danger. No, go ahead.
I say we've also lost sight of the connection between the cleansing of the sanctuary in heaven and the cleansing of the temple of our hearts on earth.
Right.
That they happen simultaneously.
That's right.
That Satan, was able to implant the idea with the emphasis on everything being here on earth in 1844, and not seeing the greater reality of what was happening in the heavenly sanctuary. But now he's sort of switched the emphasis only to that, and many Adventists don't see that there's the work that he's doing in the heavenly sanctuary is really about how he wants to cleanse our hearts and dwell in us, that we are the temple that he wants to be in.
Right.
And, God cares about people, not buildings.
And what you're saying, Craig, I think is an partial answer to what the lady had presented before. How do we come before the glory of God? And I think that is in part what you're saying. Isn't the full answer. I don't know what the full answer is, but I think that's in part of what you're saying is how we come before the glory of God.
Amen.
Yes, and the other part that I would like to, Jesus is growing up. I don't know how else to say it, right? He goes to heaven and he's, 5'10" or whatever. When he comes back, right, and Mrs. White talks about him raising Adam, he's going to be head and shoulders above Adam. So however tall. So the idea is that, see, the beauty that I'm seeing, it's all about Jesus. What happens to Jesus? Jesus is going through this process, right? So as we go through the process with him, then what happens to him, if we are in him and he is in us, happens to us or is available to us. So what Brother Craig is saying is, yeah, Jesus isn't just cleansing a building, but the truth is that Jesus himself is going through an experience here. And that experience, when he goes through it, becomes now an experience that is now available to me or to you. And if he doesn't go through that experience, then that experience is not yet available to us. And so, there's many ways to look at this, but I think the primary way we need to look at it is Jesus. What happens to him? What's going on with Jesus? That should
Amen.
be the most important. And there's a cleansing, hallowing process. It's not just a cleansing. There's a hallowing, and so it's a two-part. So sin is confessed, it's cleansed, but then there's a hallowing, which means that the broken equipment that produced that sin is restored to wholeness. So there's a cleansing of the sin which the equipment produced, but there's a restoration to the equipment so that it does not produce sin. It's restored to rightness. It's wholeness. And we have these amazing statements in Hebrews about how Jesus was made perfect through the things that he suffered. And we say, well, how can that be? He was already perfect. Well, no, that's our misunderstanding. Jesus is going through an experience and he's growing through this experience. And that experience, as he goes through it and grows through it, we go through with him and we're supposed to grow with him. And so this is part of the Day of Atonement that is really dawning on my mind, that this is a Christ journey. These are Christ events. And as I, by faith, partake or follow the Lamb with us wherever he goes, then those benefits and those experiences that happen to Christ are then experiences and benefits that are available to me. And if I stop following him and thinking, oh, what he did was good enough, I'm okay, I don't need any more of Jesus or any more of his experience, well, then I just don't understand what I'm saying. I don't understand what I'm doing. And so it's always going to be a fuller revelation. But of course, I don't know if that's a big answer to a small question or not, but
that's the example in Acts chapter 2, right? Verses in 31 through 33. The exaltation of the Son, and we get the blessing because of that. Yeah,
that's right. And you see that in every Christ event in the sanctuary.
Yeah.
So that he goes through the experience, and his experience is to become our experience.
Well, that's refinement.
Yes. And so that's what I'm saying. It's cleansing and hallowing. It's the cleansing,
because there's
and
that
then there's
process.
restoration to wholeness. And the Day of Atonement is all about restoration to holiness or wholeness, right? Because that's what atonement, to be at one with God, to come back to being in harmony with our Creator. That's his desire. That's his goal. That's his passion.
As you say, it's all about Christ. And that's why Moses was hid behind a rock. And that rock was Christ. And he saw the trail. But that rock was Christ that he was hid behind, that he could even experience the trail of the Almighty One.
That's right. And he wasn't just hid behind it, he was hid in it.
Yes.
So he's on it because he stood on the rock. He's behind it because he's staying behind the rock. And he's in it because he's hid in the rock. Which then again says, wow, well, what? And that rock was Christ. So, okay, so which is it?
It's all about.
Is it on it or behind it or in it? Well, yes, the answer is, right? And again, that just begins to show us what we're talking about. If we only describe it one way, then we're not getting it. We have to describe it the multifaceted way because it's a multifaceted experience.